In the winter of 1867, in a converted storage room at the back of the Freedmen's Bureau office in Port Gibson, Claiborne County, Mississippi, a woman named Millie Cade sat on a wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap and waited to be called. She was 57 years old, small-boned, and wore a grey dress that had been stitched and restitched so many times the original fabric was no longer visible beneath the patching. The room smelled of damp paper, ink, and the faint mold that had settled into the walls during the war years. A clerk named Levi Harcourt, who had been assigned to adjudicate disputes between former owners and the people they had once held in bondage, watched her from across a pine table cluttered with leather-bound ledgers and loose sheets of testimony. She did not fidget. She did not look at the door. She simply waited, as though she had been waiting for this moment for longer than anyone in the room could measure. The dispute that had brought Millie Cade to that room concerned 43 adults. She had told the Bureau officers, in her first statement 2 weeks earlier, that all 43 had passed through the plantation known as Pine Reach during the final years of the war and the early months after surrender. She knew their names. She knew their nicknames, the names their mothers had given them, the names they had carried before being brought to Mississippi from Virginia, from the Carolinas, from Georgia. She knew the approximate dates of their arrival and departure. She knew where each one had stood in the food distribution line that formed every Saturday morning outside the provision house, where she had worked for more than 20 years. Alonzo Keene, the man who had owned Pine Reach and who now sat across from her with 2 attorneys at his side, denied that most of those 43 people had ever lived on his property. His ledger showed no record of them. His tax inventories, filed annually with the county, listed only the enslaved people he had officially declared. His property rolls, submitted to probate courts when his father's estate was settled, contained names that did not match the ones Millie had recited. According to every document Alonzo Keene had ever signed, the 43 adults Millie Cade remembered had simply never been there. "Confusion," Keene said, when asked to explain the discrepancy. He was a tall man, with a narrow face and hands that he kept flat on the table, as though demonstrating that he had nothing to hide. Years of separation and loss. You know how these people are. They mix things up. One plantation looks like another after a while. She means well, I'm sure, but her memory cannot be relied upon. For several weeks, most people believed him. The documents were clear. The inventories were consistent. Alonzo Keene had been a respected planter, a deacon in the Methodist Church, a man whose word had carried weight in Claiborne County for 3 decades. Against his ledgers, what was the word of an illiterate woman who had spent her life handing out flour and salt and measuring cloth behind a wooden counter? But Millie Cade did not waver. When Harcourt asked her how she could be certain, she did not answer with indignation or tears. She simply began to recite. Abraham Cole, called Abe by most, came from a place near Columbia, South Carolina, in the spring of '62. Had a scar across his left eyebrow from a wagon accident when he was a boy. His mother's name was Delia. He stood third in line on Saturdays, behind the man they called Little Joe, and ahead of a woman named Esther, who walked with a limp. Esther Grimes. She arrived in the fall of '61. Her limp came from a broken ankle that never set right. She was sent to Pine Reach from a property in Hinds County after the man who owned her got into debt. She had a daughter named Caroline who stayed behind. Esther used to ask me every week if I'd heard any news of Caroline. I never had any to give her. She continued, name after name, without consulting a single piece of paper. She gave full names, family connections, approximate ages, the states or counties they had come from, and the specific spots they had occupied in the Saturday distribution line. When she finished, the room was silent. Harcourt counted 43 names in his notes. Not one had been repeated, not one had been corrected. Keen's attorneys shifted in their chairs. One of them, a man named Roscoe Thorne, who had been handling planter disputes since before the war, asked Millie how she could possibly remember so many people after so many years. "Because I decided to," she said. She did not elaborate, and Harcourt did not press her. He had heard, from others in the freedmen's community around Port Gibson, that Millie Cade was known for an extraordinary memory. People called her when they needed to verify a date or a name or a family connection that had been severed by sail or distance. She was known to recall, without error, the details of events that had occurred decades earlier. Some said it was a gift, others said it was a burden. Millie herself never commented on it. What Harcourt did not yet know, and what would take him months to uncover, was that Millie Cade's memory had not always been a tool for helping others. It had begun as a private act of resistance, a quiet and desperate response to a loss that had nearly broken her. Years before the war, when her youngest son was still a child, Millie had watched him being sold away from Pine Reach. The buyer was a man from Louisiana whose name she never learned. The transaction had taken place on the front gallery of the main house, in full view of the yard where Millie stood frozen with a sack of cornmeal in her arms. Her son was 12 years old. His name was Jonas. He had her husband's wide forehead and her own small hands. She watched him being led to a wagon, and she watched the wagon disappear down the road that led to the river, and she never saw him again. In the months that followed, Millie developed a practice that she maintained for the rest of her life. Whenever a new person arrived at Pine Reach, she asked them 3 questions. What was their true name? What name did their family call them? And where had they come from? She did not write the answers down. She was not permitted to learn to write. Instead, she stored them in her memory, filing each one away like a document in a drawer she alone could access. She did this, she later explained to Harcourt, because she had realized something that the men who owned Pine Reach had never understood. Names were the only things that could not be taken away by force. A person could be sold, separated, beaten, worked to exhaustion, buried in an unmarked grave, but a name once spoken and remembered persisted. It was proof that a person had existed. It was the only record that mattered. Alonzo Keen's ledgers told one story, Millie Cade's memory told another, and in the winter of 1867, in that damp room behind the Freedmen's Bureau office, the 2 stories began to collide. The first indication that Millie's version might be more accurate than Keen's came from an unexpected source. Harcourt, in the course of reviewing the documents Keen had submitted, noticed something odd about the plantation's operational records. The official inventories, the ones filed with the county and presented to courts, were meticulous and consistent. They listed the enslaved population of Pine Reach in clean columns: name, age, sex, valuation. But the working records of the plantation told a different story. Harcourt found an account book kept by the blacksmith at Pine Reach. A man named Isaac Flood, who had been enslaved and who continued to work at the forge for wages after emancipation. Between entries for horseshoes and wagon wheels and plough repairs, Flood had recorded names: men for whom he had repaired tools, men who had brought him broken equipment, men who had worked alongside him at the forge. Several of these names matched the ones Millie had recited, but when Harcourt cross-referenced them with the official inventories, they did not appear. The blacksmith's book contained a repair entry for a man named Willis Pruitt, dated August of 1863. Willis Pruitt was one of the 43 names Millie had remembered. According to Keen's inventories, no one by that name had ever been enslaved at Pine Reach. Yet Flood had recorded him as having broken a hoe and brought it to the forge for mending. A second book, used to track cloth distribution among the workers, contained 11 more names from Millie's list. The book was kept by a woman named Celia Flood, Isaac's wife, who had been responsible for measuring and distributing fabric to the enslaved population. Her entries were brief: a name, a yardage, a date. But they were consistent over time. The same names appeared week after week, receiving the same allotments of shirting or osnaburg or wool that the officially listed workers received. Harcourt brought these records to his supervisor, a bureau officer named Colonel Marcus Redding, who had been appointed to oversee the Port Gibson office after serving with the Union Army during the war. Redding was a methodical man, a former lawyer from Ohio who approached each case as though preparing for trial. He studied the blacksmith's book and the cloth distribution records for a long time before speaking. "These are working documents," he said. "They were never meant to be seen by anyone outside the plantation. The blacksmith needed to know whose tools he was repairing. The cloth woman needed to know who was receiving fabric. They kept accurate records because accuracy mattered to their work. The official inventories, on the other hand, mattered for taxes and probate and debt collection. Those were the documents Keene had reason to falsify." The question then was why? Why would Alonzo Keene maintain such meticulous operational records if the people they documented did not officially exist? The answer, when it began to emerge, was more disturbing than anything Harcourt or Redding had anticipated. The first explanation they considered was that Keene had hired temporary workers from neighboring plantations. This was a common practice in the region. Planters often rented enslaved workers from one another during harvest or planting seasons, paying a fee to the owner and returning the workers when the work was done. If the 43 people Millie remembered had been temporary hires, their names would not appear on Keene's inventories because they were never his property. But when Harcourt searched for rental contracts, he found nothing. Keene's papers contained no agreements with other planters, no receipts for labor payments, no correspondence arranging temporary transfers. If the 43 had been hired workers, there should have been a paper trail. There was none. Harcourt began visiting neighboring properties, speaking with families who had been enslaved in the region and who had remained there after emancipation. What he found was a pattern that repeated itself with disturbing consistency. Several families remembered adult relatives who had been sent to Pine Reach temporarily, usually at times when their owners were facing legal or financial difficulties. A son sent away just before a creditor arrived. A husband transferred shortly before a bankruptcy filing. A brother relocated in the weeks before an estate inventory was conducted. After the crisis passed, the relatives were supposed to return, but some of them never did. They were listed in subsequent documents as having been sold to distant buyers, or transferred to plantations in other states, or simply disappeared from the written record. Millie Cade, when Harcourt asked her about these cases, confirmed what the families suspected. She had seen many of those people at Pine Reach months after their supposed departures. They had been working in the fields, receiving rations from her window, standing in the Saturday distribution line in the same spots week after week. Whatever the documents said, they had not been sold to Louisiana or Georgia or anywhere else. They had been hidden. The investigation shifted direction when Harcourt located a man named Wade Larkin, who had served as the overseer of Pine Reach's storage warehouses for nearly 15 years before emancipation. Larkin was in his late 60s, a weathered man with a permanent squint and hands that trembled slightly when he was agitated. He had remained in Claiborne County after the war, living in a small cabin on the edge of what had once been Keene's property and working odd jobs for neighboring farms. At first, Larkin was reluctant to speak. He had worked for Keene for most of his adult life and still felt a residual loyalty to the man who had employed him. But Harcourt, who had learned during his months at the Bureau that persistence often yielded more than authority, visited Larkin 3 times before the older man agreed to talk candidly. What Larkin described was a system that had operated for years, refined through practice and protected by deliberate fragmentation of information. Pine Reach, he said, had functioned as a kind of repository for enslaved people whose ownership was legally contested. When planters in the region faced debt collection, lawsuits, estate settlements, or other legal proceedings that required an accounting of their property, they would quietly move some of their enslaved workers to Keene's land. The transfers were never documented. The workers were absorbed into Pine Reach's existing labor force, organized into groups identified not by name, but by letter. Groups A, C, F, H, Larkin said. Those were the ones I remember. Might have been more. Each group had a number of hands in it. That was all anyone needed to know. How many people were working in which field? Their names didn't matter for the work. When the legal danger passed, some of the hidden workers returned to their original owners. Others were sold privately to new buyers, with the transactions arranged through intermediaries, so that no direct record connected Keene to the sales. A few remained at Pine Reach indefinitely, their existence erased from every official document that might be scrutinized by a court or a creditor. The system, Larkin explained, served two purposes. It protected planters from having their labor force seized or reduced during legal proceedings. And it allowed them to profit from the work of people who, on paper, had been disposed of or never existed in the first place. Keene charged fees for his services, taking a percentage of the workers' output or receiving payments from the planters whose property he was sheltering. Harcourt asked Larkin how many people had passed through this system. Larkin estimated perhaps 15 or 20 adults in total, spread over several years. Millie's figure of 43, he insisted, was an exaggeration born of confusion. She had probably counted the same people multiple times under different names, or included workers from neighboring plantations who had visited Pine Reach temporarily. For a time, Harcourt was inclined to accept this explanation. 15 or 20 hidden workers was a significant number, enough to confirm that Keene had been engaged in systematic fraud. But it was also a number that seemed proportionate to the evidence he had gathered so far. The blacksmith's book and the cloth records had yielded a dozen names. The testimony from neighboring families had added several more. 43 seemed excessive. Then Harcourt found the records from the cotton gin house. The gin house at Pine Reach was a two-story brick building located near the western boundary of the property, where the cotton from Keene's fields and from several smaller neighboring farms was processed before being baled and shipped to market. The building had its own set of records, maintained by a succession of overseers who tracked the amount of cotton processed each day, the number of workers assigned to each shift, and the output per worker. These records were different from the ones Harcourt had examined before. They did not use names. Instead, they used letters and numbers. A typical entry read, Group A, 6 hands, morning shift, £42 per hand, or Group F, 4 hands, full day, £38 average. The letters corresponded to the groups Larkin had mentioned. The numbers indicated how many people were working. Harcourt spent 3 days going through the gin house records, correlating dates and group assignments with the testimony Millie had given. What he found was remarkable. On dates when Millie remembered new arrivals appearing at Pine Reach, the gin house records showed an increase in the number of workers assigned to particular letter groups. The increases were consistent with the arrival dates Millie had cited, sometimes varying by only a day or two. When Harcourt totaled the additional workers who appeared in the gin house records but not in the official inventories, the number came to 43. Exactly the number Millie had recited from memory. The discovery explained why the 43 names had almost never appeared together in any single document. Keene had deliberately avoided creating a complete list. A single roster would have been proof that he was concealing assets belonging to other men and participating in a conspiracy to defraud creditors. Instead, he had fragmented the information across multiple record-keeping systems, each maintained by a different person for a different purpose. The blacksmith recorded names because he needed to return tools to their proper owners. The cloth distributor recorded names because she needed to track who had received their allotment of fabric. The cook recorded numbers because he needed to know how many meals to prepare. The gin house overseer used letters because he only needed to track productivity by group. No single person, except Keene himself, had access to all the records, and even Keene, as it turned out, did not have the complete picture. That was the irony that Harcourt uncovered next, and it was the revelation that changed everything. In the course of examining a seemingly mundane corn distribution ledger from 1863, Harcourt noticed something that made him stop and read more carefully. In several weeks during that year, the clerk who maintained the ledger had made errors in counting the number of workers present. Beside the corrections, in handwriting that Harcourt had learned to recognize from other documents, was a note written by Alonzo Keene himself. The note read, "When the count does not match, ask Millie. She knows every name and does not confuse who has come or gone." Harcourt read the note 3 times to make sure he had understood it correctly. Then he searched for other similar references. He found them scattered throughout the plantation's records, in ledgers from multiple years and multiple departments. A note in the Provision House records from 1861. Millie confirms 2 new arrivals this week, both from the Lawson property. A marginal annotation in a cloth distribution book from 1862. Millie says the woman called Patience has a child who also requires fabric. Adjust accordingly. A slip of paper tucked into the blacksmith's account book, dated 1864. Ask Millie whether the man who calls himself Joseph is the same one who was here in the spring. She will remember. Alonzo Keene, the man who was now trying to convince a Freedmen's Bureau tribunal that Millie Cade was a confused old woman whose memory could not be trusted, had spent years relying on that same memory as a critical component of his plantation's accounting system. He had done so precisely because he had needed to avoid creating written records that could be used against him. Without realizing it, he had transformed a woman who was not permitted to keep records into his most reliable archive. The implications of this discovery rippled outward through the investigation. If Keene had trusted Millie's memory when it served his interests, then her testimony about the 43 hidden workers could not be dismissed as the ramblings of a confused woman. She had been, in effect, the unofficial record-keeper of Pine Reach, maintaining in her mind the comprehensive roster that Keene had been too cautious to commit to paper. Harcourt presented his findings to Colonel Redding, who convened a formal hearing in the spring of 1867. The hearing was held in the same converted storage room where the initial testimony had been taken, but the atmosphere was different now. Alonzo Keene arrived with 3 attorneys instead of 2. His face was thinner than it had been in February, and the confidence that had characterized his earlier appearances had given way to a watchful, calculating stillness. Millie Cade arrived alone, wearing the same grey dress she had worn to every previous session. She took her seat on the wooden bench and folded her hands in her lap, and if she felt any satisfaction at the turn the investigation had taken, her face did not show it. The hearing lasted 4 days. Harcourt presented the blacksmith's book, the cloth distribution records, the gin house ledgers, and the corn distribution book with Keene's handwritten notes. He called Wade Larkin to testify about the system of hidden workers. He called Isaac and Celia Flood to confirm that the names in their records corresponded to real people who had worked at Pine Reach. He called several freedmen and freedwomen from the surrounding area who identified relatives among the 43 names Millie had recited. Keene's attorneys mounted a vigorous defense. They argued that the operational records were unreliable, maintained by enslaved people who had no formal training in bookkeeping and who might have recorded names incorrectly. They argued that the letter groups in the gin house records could have referred to the same workers being reorganized into different teams, rather than additional workers being added to the labor force. They argued that Keene's notes about consulting Millie merely showed that he was a considerate employer who valued the knowledge of his workers, not that he was using her as a surrogate record keeper. But the central argument, the one they returned to again and again, was that Millie's memory could not be trusted. She was old, she was illiterate, she had suffered losses and hardships that would have confused anyone. The 43 names she had recited might be real people, but how could anyone be certain that they had all passed through Pine Reach? How could anyone be certain that she had not combined memories from different times and different places into a single narrative? Millie listened to these arguments without visible reaction. When she was called to testify again, Harcourt asked her a question that he had been saving for the final day of the hearing. "Mrs. Cade," he said, "can you tell us the names of the 43 again, in the same order as before?" She could, she did. And when Harcourt checked his notes from her first testimony 3 months earlier, the names were identical. The order was identical. Not a single omission, not a single deviation. Whatever else her memory might be, it was not confused. The hearing concluded without a definitive ruling. Colonel Redding issued a finding that Alonzo Keene had engaged in irregular labor practices and had failed to maintain accurate property records as required by law. He referred the matter to the civil courts for further adjudication and recommended that Keene's remaining property be subject to review by creditors who might have been defrauded. But the larger question, the question of what had happened to the 43 people Millie remembered, remained only partially answered. The investigation had confirmed that additional workers had been present at Pine Reach beyond those listed in the official inventories. It had confirmed that Keene had participated in a system of concealing enslaved people from legal scrutiny. But locating the individuals themselves proved far more difficult. Some of the 43 had been found. They had resurfaced in other counties, in other states, often under different names. A man Millie had known as Willis Pruitt was living in Tennessee under the surname of his wife's former owner. A woman called Esther Grimes, the one with the limp who had asked every week about her daughter Caroline, had been located in Arkansas, where she had been sold 2 years before emancipation. She was reunited with her daughter, who had also survived the war, in the summer of 1868. Harcourt, who had continued working on the case long after the official hearing ended, arranged for the Bureau to provide transport for the reunion. But many of the 43 remained only as fragmentary references, a name in a blacksmith's book, a yardage in a cloth record, a letter and number in a gin house ledger. The people themselves had been dispersed by the war, by sale, by death, by the chaos that followed emancipation. They had scattered across the South and beyond, carrying their names with them, and in many cases those names had changed or been forgotten by everyone, except the woman who had once handed them flour and salt from a wooden counter at Pine Reach. Alonzo Keene lost a portion of his property in subsequent legal disputes. Several creditors, alerted by the Bureau's findings, filed claims against his remaining assets. A group of planters who had participated in the concealment system settled privately rather than risk public exposure. Keene himself never faced criminal charges, as most of the participants argued that the arrangements had been private administrative practices rather than deliberate fraud. He died in 1872, 5 years after the hearing. At his home in Port Gibson, his obituary in the local newspaper described him as a respected citizen and devoted churchman, and made no mention of the investigation. Millie Cade continued to live in Claiborne County after the hearing. She worked for several years as a domestic servant in Port Gibson, then moved to a small cabin on land she purchased with wages she had saved. She never learned to read or write. She continued to help freed families compare names, places, and kinship connections, serving as a living archive for a community whose written records had been systematically erased or falsified. People came to her from across the region. They came with fragments of memory, a mother's name, a brother's scar, a child sold away before the war. Millie would listen, and then, more often than not, she would remember. She knew who had been where and when. She knew which names had been changed and which had been preserved. She knew the connections that the documents had tried to sever. She never knew what had become of her son Jonas, the boy she had watched being taken away in a wagon decades earlier. She asked every new arrival, every visitor, every traveler passing through, whether they had heard of a man named Jonas Cade, who would have been in his 30s or 40s by the end of the war. No one ever had news of him. His name remained in her memory, the one that led nowhere. Millie Cade died in the spring of 1883 at the age of 73. She was buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Port Gibson, in a plot she had purchased herself. Her grave was marked with a simple stone that gave her name and the years of her life and nothing else. She left behind no notebooks, no lists, no written record of the names she had carried in her memory for so many years. The most complete register of her extraordinary recall remained, ironically, in the documents of the plantation whose owner had tried to discredit her. The marginal notes in Keen's ledgers, the names in the blacksmith's book, the cloth distribution records, the gin house logs, the investigators' transcripts, all of them preserved fragments of the information Millie had stored in her mind, like pieces of a mirror that reflected different angles of the same truth. The Bureau's records from the Pine Reach case were filed with the War Department in Washington and eventually transferred to the National Archives, where they were catalogued and stored. For decades, they sat undisturbed among thousands of other freedmen's Bureau documents, their significance unrecognized by anyone who might have reason to examine them. Then, in the summer of 1963, a young archivist named Robert Denby was assigned to process a backlog of Bureau records that had been microfilmed as part of a preservation initiative. Denby was 28 years old, a graduate student in history at Howard University, and he had spent the previous 2 years working through boxes of documents that no one had examined in generations. He found the Pine Reach file on a Thursday afternoon in July. It was contained in a single acid-free folder, discolored with age, but otherwise intact. The label read, "Freedmen's Bureau, Port Gibson Office, Keene versus Cade, 1867. Inside were the transcripts of the hearing, the blacksmith's book, the cloth distribution records, the gin house ledgers, and the corn distribution book with Alonzo Keene's handwritten notes. Denby read through the file twice, then a third time. He was struck by the story itself, by the strange and tragic system it documented, by the woman whose memory had held together a record that the men in power had tried to erase. But what stayed with him most, what he thought about for days afterward, was a single detail buried in the margins of one of the ledgers. It was the note Keene had written in the corn distribution book. "When the count does not match, ask Millie. She knows every name and does not confuse who has come or gone." Denby had spent enough time with 19th century documents to understand what this note meant. It meant that the man who had owned Pine Reach, The man who had engineered a system to hide human beings from legal scrutiny, the man who had tried to convince a tribunal that Millie Cade was a confused old woman, had known exactly what she was capable of. He had relied on her memory because it was more reliable than any written record he could create. He had used her as his archive while denying her the dignity of being recognized as one. And then, when the system that had empowered him collapsed, he had tried to discredit the very memory he had depended on. He had tried to erase the names she had preserved. He had tried to make her seem unreliable, confused, mistaken, the same woman whose mind he had once trusted to track the comings and goings of dozens of people whose existence he needed to keep hidden. The irony was perfect and devastating. During slavery, the men of Pine Reach had trusted Millie's memory when it protected their interests. After freedom, they had tried to destroy her credibility the moment that same memory began to protect the people whose names they had tried to erase. Denby wrote a paper about the Pine Reach case, which was published in a small academic journal in 1965. It attracted modest attention among historians of Reconstruction and the Freedmen's Bureau, but the wider significance of the story remained obscure. The paper was cited in a handful of subsequent studies, referenced in footnotes and bibliographies, and then gradually absorbed into the vast body of scholarship on the period. In the fall of 1968, 5 years after Denby's discovery, a team of researchers from the University of Mississippi conducted a survey of Freedmen's Bureau records related to Claiborne County. They were compiling a database of labor disputes, property claims, and family reunification efforts in the immediate post-emancipation period. One of the researchers, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, came across the Pine Reach file during a visit to the National Archives. Hartwell was particularly interested in the role of memory in the freed community's efforts to reconstruct family relationships after emancipation. She had been collecting testimonies, letters, and bureau records that documented how formerly enslaved people had used oral traditions, shared recollections, and collective memory to locate lost relatives and assert their identities against the erasures of the slave system. The Pine Reach case, she realized, was a remarkable example of a phenomenon she had been documenting in fragments across multiple archives. Here was a single woman whose memory had functioned as a counter-archive, preserving information that the official records had deliberately excluded. Here was a confrontation between two systems of knowledge, the written ledgers of the planters, which were official but false, and the oral memory of an enslaved woman, which was unofficial but true. Hartwell expanded her research to include the Pine Reach case, traveling to Mississippi to search for additional records and, if possible, for descendants of the people Millie Cade had remembered. She spent 3 weeks in Claiborne County, visiting courthouses, churches, cemeteries, and the sites where Pine Reach had once stood. The plantation itself was gone. The main house had burned in the 1920s, and the land had been subdivided and sold to small farmers. The gin house, where the letter group records had been maintained, had collapsed decades earlier. The provision house where Millie had worked was a pile of weathered boards half buried in kudzu. There was nothing left of the physical structures that had contained the system of concealment she had documented in her memory, but Hartwell found other traces. In the county courthouse in Port Gibson, she located the legal records of Keene's property disputes from the late 1860s. In a church cemetery outside town, she found the grave of Wade Larkin, the warehouse overseer who had testified about the letter groups. In the state archives in Jackson, she found a file of correspondence between the Freedmen's Bureau office in Port Gibson and the regional headquarters in Vicksburg, including several letters that referenced the Pine Reach investigation, and in a small African Methodist Episcopal church in a community called Freeman's Crossing, about 12 miles from the site of Pine Reach, Hartwell found a woman named Adeline Cade, who was Millie's great-granddaughter. Adeline was 71 years old a retired school teacher who had spent her career educating black children in the segregated schools of Claiborne County. She had grown up hearing stories about Millie from her grandmother, who had been one of Millie's surviving children. She remembered everything, Adeline told Hartwell, sitting in the front room of her small house on a September afternoon. That was the story we all heard. Millie remembered everything. She remembered names and dates and faces and things that happened when she was a child. She remembered people that everyone else had forgotten. When folks in the community needed to know something about the old times, they went to Millie. Adeline had never seen the Bureau records, had never known that her great-grandmother's testimony had been preserved in a federal archive. She listened quietly as Hartwell described the investigation, the hearing, the discovery of Keene's notes in the corn distribution ledger. "I'm not surprised," she said, when Hartwell had finished. "That man knew what she could do. They all knew. They just didn't think it mattered unless they could use it for themselves." Hartwell's research on the Pine Reach case was included in a book she published in 1972 titled Archives of the Unwritten: Memory and Resistance in the Post-Emancipation South. The book received favorable reviews and was adopted as a supplementary text in several university courses on Reconstruction and African American history. The chapter on Millie Cade was frequently cited as a compelling example of how enslaved people had developed alternative systems of knowledge that challenged and sometimes defeated the documentary authority of their oppressors. But the story never reached a wide audience. It remained within the circles of academic history, known to specialists and graduate students, but not to the general public. Millie Cade's name did not appear in textbooks or documentaries. The remarkable confrontation between her memory and Alonzo Keene's ledgers did not become part of the standard narrative of Reconstruction. Years passed. Hartwell died in 1991. Robert Denby, the archivist who had first discovered the Pine Reach file, died in 1997. The microfilm copies of the Bureau records, including the Pine Reach case, were eventually digitized as part of a broader initiative to make historical archives available online. They sat on servers, accessible to anyone who knew where to look, but largely unexamined. The story of Millie Cade might have remained in that obscurity had it not been for a doctoral student named James Whitfield, who was researching his dissertation on record-keeping practices in the antebellum South when he came across a reference to Hartwell's book. Whitfield was interested in the ways that plantations had documented their operations, the systems they had used to track labor and productivity and inventory. He was not specifically looking for stories of resistance or memory. But when he read Hartwell's account of the Pine Reach case, he realized that it raised questions that went beyond the scope of his dissertation. How had the system of concealment worked, exactly? How widespread had it been? How many other plantations had served as repositories for hidden workers during legal proceedings? And how many other people, like Millie Cade, had preserved in their memories the records that the planters had been too cautious to write down? Whitfield spent the next 4 years investigating these questions. He traveled to archives across the South, searching for evidence of similar concealment systems. He found fragments, a reference in a Georgia court case to workers temporarily relocated during a probate dispute, a letter from a South Carolina planter mentioning arrangements with a neighbor to shelter property from creditors, a Freedmen's Bureau record from Alabama documenting a system of borrowing workers between plantations during legal difficulties. None of the cases he found were as well documented as Pine Reach. Most had been deliberately obscured, their records destroyed or never created in the first place. The fragmentary nature of the evidence was itself evidence of how effectively the system had worked. The planters had hidden their tracks so thoroughly that even the traces were hard to find. But the question that stayed with Whitfield, the question that he struggled to answer, was the one that had struck Robert Denby when he first read Keene's note in the corn distribution book. How had a woman who was not permitted to read or write become the most reliable record keeper on the plantation? And what did it mean that the man who owned her had trusted her memory enough to use it as his backup system, while simultaneously denying in court that her memory could be trusted at all? The answer, Whitfield eventually concluded, was not that Alonzo Keene was uniquely hypocritical. It was that the entire system of plantation record-keeping was built on a contradiction. The planters needed accurate information to manage their operations, but they also needed deniability to protect themselves from legal consequences. They needed to know who was working on their land, but they also needed to be able to claim that those people had never been there. Millie Cade had been the solution to this contradiction. Whether Keene had consciously understood it or not, she was an archive that could not be subpoenaed, a database that could not be entered into evidence, a record that existed only in her mind and was therefore invisible to any court or creditor. As long as she was enslaved, her memory served the interests of the men who owned her. The moment she was free, that same memory became a threat. The Pine Reach case, Whitfield wrote in his own book, published in 2009, 42 years after Robert Denby first opened the folder in the National Archives, was not just a story about one woman's extraordinary memory. It was a story about the relationship between knowledge and power, about the ways that records can be made to lie, and the ways that truth can be preserved without being written down. It was a story about the moment when the archive and the counter-archive collided, and the counter-archive won. Adeline Cade lived to see the publication of Whitfield's book. She was 97 years old, frail but lucid, living in a nursing home in Jackson. A reporter from a regional newspaper interviewed her about her great-grandmother, and the article that resulted was the first time Millie Cade's name had appeared in the popular press. They tried to say she was confused, Adeline told the reporter, her voice thin but steady. They tried to say she didn't know what she was talking about, but the records proved her right. The records that man kept, he proved her right without meaning to. He wrote down that they should ask Millie. He knew they all knew. They just didn't want anyone else to know. Adeline Cade died in 2011 at the age of 99. She was the last surviving descendant of Millie Cade, who had direct knowledge of the family stories passed down through the generations. With her death, the oral tradition that had preserved Millie's memory within the family came to an end. What remained were the written records, the bureau files, the academic books, the microfilm, and digital archives. The story had passed from memory to document, from the living voice to the preserved page. If you go to Port Gibson, Mississippi today, you will find no monument to Millie Cade. There is no historical marker at the site of Pine Reach. There is no plaque in the county courthouse commemorating the investigation that exposed Alonzo Keene's system of concealment. The cemetery where Millie is buried is still there, on a rise of ground outside town, but many of the older stones have weathered to illegibility. No one is certain which grave is hers, but the Freedmen's Bureau records remain. They are housed in the National Archives in Washington, digitized and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The Pine Reach file is there, catalogued and cross-referenced, waiting for the next researcher who will find it and recognize what it contains. And in the margins of a corn distribution ledger from 1863, in handwriting that has faded but not vanished, there is still the note that Alonzo Keene wrote when he needed an accurate count of the people who worked on his land. The note that he wrote without imagining that it would ever be read by anyone outside the plantation. The note that more than a century later would prove the truth of what Millie Cade remembered. When the count does not match, ask Millie. She knows every name and does not confuse who has come or gone. The 43 names she recited have survived in the transcripts of the hearing. Some of the people they belonged to survived as well, scattered across the South, carrying their names into new lives in new places. Others remained only as names, entries in ledgers and account books, references in the testimony of people who remembered them. Their stories are incomplete, fragmented, partial, but their names persist. Millie Cade's name persists as well. It appears in the bureau records, in the academic books, in the footnotes and citations. It appears in the memory of a family that told stories about her for generations. It appears in this account, which is only the most recent retelling of a story that has been told and retold, in different forms and different contexts, for more than 100 years. She never wrote a single word. She never kept a notebook or a list. The names she carried were stored in her mind alone, a private archive that no one else could access. When she died, that archive died with her, but the records that proved her right survived. The documents that the men of Pine Reach created to manage their operations, the records they never intended to be used against them, became the evidence that confirmed everything she had said. And the final irony, the one that Robert Denby noted in the paper he wrote in 1965 and that Eleanor Hartwell elaborated in her book and that James Whitfield returned to in his own work decades later, is that Alonzo Keene himself had created the most damning piece of evidence. The note in the corn distribution book, the instruction to ask Millie when the count did not match, was written in his own hand. It was an admission, unintended and unwitting, that the woman he was now calling confused and unreliable was in fact the most accurate source of information on his plantation. During slavery, the men of Pine Reach trusted Millie's memory when it protected their interests. After freedom, they tried to destroy her credibility in the same moment that her memory began to protect the people whose names they had tried to erase. The archive they built condemned them. The counter-archive she carried in her mind outlasted them. The Pine Reach file sits in a box in the National Archives, waiting for the next pair of eyes. The corn distribution ledger is there, its margins inscribed with Keene's fading script. The blacksmith's book, the cloth records, the gin house logs, the hearing transcripts, all of them are there, preserved against the decay that has claimed the buildings and the graves and the bodies of the people who made them. And somewhere in those documents, listed by name and date and circumstance, are the 43 people Millie Cade remembered. Abraham Cole, Esther Grimes, Willis Pruitt, and the others whose names she recited in that converted storage room in the winter of 1867. They are there, in the margins and the footnotes, in the account books and the ledgers, in the testimony of a woman who decided, after watching her son being taken away in a wagon, that she would remember every name. She did.